over COVID with, oh my
Yes,
gosh,
you've had 3 series of 3, and
that's
then this
right.
is the 10th.
Oh my goodness, time flies, right? So, and you're
Yes,
all still listening? That's
of
the real
course.
surprise. Good to be back again, and thank you, Rhonda. And just thank you to the friends. I was saying off air to everybody earlier that I'm a big fan of libraries. I've always been a bibliophile and a supporter of libraries. I think in this day and age of political divide, of shaky economy, of just international crisis, of the pandemic, alternative facts, a war on the truth, a war on science, a war on reason. Libraries become a hub to the community, and books become all the more important. My goodness, here in Florida, we're banning books. Who would have thunk it, right? This is not the Middle Ages. So libraries become all the more important. So I want to just give a shout out to the Friends organization, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart. Libraries are just vital resources for filling so many niches in the community. So thank you. That's why I'm happy to be here. So today's topic, goodness, we've covered an awful lot of topics here, but for a couple reasons. One, I'm a feminist, so I'm proud to talk about intriguing and inspiring heroines from history. Two, the Watson clan. I've always felt is a matrilineal clan. My maternal grandmother, I think, made it to the 4th grade, raised the entire city, I believe. Was just a dynamo, a remarkable person. My mother was a remarkable and accomplished person. My sister's a type A, strong individual, and my daughter's taking in their footprints. So the Watsons are quite matrilineal. But another reason why I thought this would be interesting is, as an historian, I know that women's voices have been systematically rendered invisible. Women are voiceless in history. Most women who have ever lived have been illiterate, even in the United States through the 1800s. Most women lacked, if they were literate, lacked any kind of substantive education. Women throughout much of American history could not legally divorce, own land, appear in a court of law, vote, and the list goes on. And even if women were literate, what man would see fit to preserve and then celebrate their voices? So a lot of us here on the call today grew up in a day and age where, we just didn't read female authors and we didn't have women's perspectives on history. So this is a topic that's always been interesting to me. So what I wanted to do was tell you stories of 10 of my heroines from history. So I started making my list and I got it down to 25. And I'm thinking, now who do I get rid of? And I didn't know what to do. So painstakingly, I only got it down to, I think I have 16. So then I gave up. So I thought I would just do 16 instead of 10. Better than a baker's dozen, right? So Friends of Stirling Road Library, dozen plus. And I tried to pick some women that you would know and some women that you wouldn't know. I tried to get different periods in history. I tried to get women of different ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. I tried to get women whose contributions varied considerably. But here's a list of 16 of I think my list started with about 50, my heroines that I've always admired from history. And what a better place to start than with Martha Washington. So we all know George Washington was the father of his country. Having written a book on George Washington, having written on Martha, having written on the founders for 3 decades, I can tell you if George was the father of his country, Martha's deserving the title of mother of her country. Martha Washington is a little understood, little known, but a remarkable woman. She's presented to us today very simplistically according to that portrait on the left. There are a few paintings of Martha that have survived, and in all of them she looks like she doesn't want to be sitting for the portrait. Of all of them, the one on the left I'm showing you now is probably the closest you'll get to a smile or an agreement from Martha. She was very private, hated having her painting done. Unfortunately, we know her as this Betty Crocker, Mrs. Santa Claus kind of grandmother when she was so much more than that. Martha left behind roughly 157 letters, and the letters reveal a complicated and inspiring individual. Yet, history pretty much is only focused on one single letter of hers. There's a letter where she's asked to describe herself. And she writes, and I quote, "I'm an old-fashioned Virginia housekeeper, busy as a bee, steady as a clock, cheerful as a cricket," end quote. That's a cute quote, but that presents her very simplistically. Martha was a dynamo. She spent every winter of the Revolutionary War. Now remember, this is a long war. Started in the spring of 1775 and ends in September of 1783. She spent every winter of the war in camp with her husband, oftentimes in tents. Now think about this. Going to camp meant traveling hundreds of miles in the dead of winter on unpaved roads in an open carriage through enemy territory with no GPS. So Martha was quite something. What did she do in camp? Alexander Hamilton once wrote that Washington was very glum, depressed. His temper was volcanic. Then Martha showed up in camp, and Hamilton wrote, quote unquote, "The good general has been inconsolable. Now we can finally get down to the matter of winning the war." Martha was there. She calmed George down. She, like every grandmother and bubby I know, she cooked for the army. You know, she was sewing uniforms, mending socks, holding the hands of dying men, helping them write letters to loved ones. You know, and think of the impact. I don't think you can overstate it, quite frankly. A bitterly cold winter, let's say Valley Forge, everybody knows that winter. A bitterly cold winter, you're freezing to death, you haven't been paid, you're scared to death, the enemy's wiping you out, you think you're gonna die, you miss your mom, and then here comes this Betty Crocker grandmother in to hold your hand and make you something to eat and sew a scarf for you. Martha inspired the army. They called her Lady Washington. They even created a cavalry unit called Lady Washington's Dragoon in her honor. Martha was traveling to camp one winter, and she traveled through a town. Crowds came up. People followed her carriage down the road. The soldiers came out and asked that she wait so they could do a 21-gun salute. People loved her. Martha writes back home, and she wrote, quote unquote, "It's as if I was a very great somebody." And Martha was humble on top of everything else. George helps to create, through his every action and inaction, everything he says and doesn't say, the office of the presidency. Well, while he was doing that, Martha creates the office of the First Lady through her every action. Now, she's got a challenge as the First Lady. She has to make the president's house and her social affairs regal enough to give this nascent, fledgling republic, this new experiment in democracy, credibility. But she can't have it too regal, or she'd be aping Europe, the monarchs. And this is supposed to be democratic simplicity. She managed to find the balance, the 50-yard line, and just do a remarkable job. After George's death, people continue to pay her respects. George died on mid-December of 1799. Martha lives until early May of 1802, so she lives 2.5 years beyond him. People came by the loads to pay their respects, and Martha would greet, even though she was grieving, she was private. She took the time to greet everyone. She saved a stash of money. Whenever there was a veteran, she gave the veteran money. Martha was just a remarkable person. George was her second marriage. Her first marriage was probably to the wealthiest man in Virginia, 20 years her senior. He was 37, she was 17. He was from the upper echelon. She was middle upper class. So the fact that she married so far above her station to a much older wealthy man shows that she had something on the ball, because Virginia, of all of the colonies, was by far the most class conscious. It was the most like England, whereas some of the other colonies, Pennsylvania, Georgia, were quite the opposite. But so Martha's first husband, her own father, her husband's father, and 2 of her 4 kids all died back to back to back to back. She has 2 other children. Her daughter, Patsy, dies of an epileptic seizure at the dinner table as a teenager. She has 1 son left, Jackie. She doesn't want him to go in the military. It's an embarrassment for George Washington that his wife's son is not serving while he's calling on everyone to serve. Martha is, rightly so, a hypochondriac by this time, having lost everyone around her. She's scared to death about George's life. She doesn't want to lose Jackie. Finally, in 1781, at what is probably the pivotal battle of the entire war, that would be the Battle of Yorktown, in the early fall of 1781, September, October. Martha reluctantly agrees to allow Jackie to go to Yorktown, but only as George Washington's secretary. So Jackie would just handle correspondence. He goes there and catches a camp fever and dies right away. So Martha buries all four of her children. Just a rough life. She was very, as I said, private, never wanted any of this. She was a reluctant first lady, although unlike some other reluctant first ladies, she served. And she served with dignity and with honor and during a war because of her great sense of duty and her love of this new republic. So Martha Washington is a good way to start us off. This is Laura Secord. Do I have any Canadians on the call today? Any Canadians? Okay, so I'm an honorary Canadian. Oh, hi, Marilyn. I'm an honorary Canadian. I go to Toronto often to lecture for years. I write and research TV series for like the Science Channel, the Discovery Channel, and I've appeared on a lot of them. And the company I work with is out of Toronto. I love Ottawa. I love Halifax. So I'm quite the Canuck, even though I'm not a hockey fan. But I love Canada. So I'm a big Laura Secord fan. Plus they named some darn fine chocolates after her, which I always stock up every time I'm north of the border. Laura Secord is Canada's, Betsy Ross, I guess you could say. She is a heroine in Canada. There's stamps made of her. There's a statue of her in Ottawa at the Capitol. There's songs about her. There's just everything. Chocolate Company, you name it. So the story is quite compelling. Laura's first husband was an American from Massachusetts, fought in the Revolution. She buried the first husband, remarries, and moves to Canada. She's living in the Niagara Falls region near the lake, Ontario. And the War of 1812 breaks out. It would run from 1812 to January of 1815. A war named for 1 year, but fought for 2.5. And the Americans, basically the short of it, is the Americans try to invade Canada. America tried with 7 entire armies over a 2-year period, and a handful of Canadians, a handful of British, a handful of Mohawk Indians whooped all 7 massive American armies. It's quite remarkable. This is why the War of 1812 is never in our textbooks, because it's an embarrassment to America in every sense of the word. Britain and Canada was benefited by having a general named Isaac Brock, who was one of the greatest generals ever to live, a young, just beast of a man who was brilliant. They also had probably the greatest American Indian leader ever to live, and that would be the great chief Tecumseh. So those two really helped flip the script on the Americans. At any rate, America finally wins, and that's at a place called Queenston Heights. The British and Canadians have the high ground, but Isaac Brock gets killed at that battle in 1813. With Brock dead, the British and the Canadian resistance folds. The Americans take it. The Americans march into Canada. They have a massive army. They're preparing a full invasion of Canada, and it looks like there's no way to stop them. The British and Canadians have virtually no one ready to stop them. The Americans make a mistake. They decide to use Laura Secord's house as their headquarters. Laura has children at home. Her family's struggling because of the war. Her husband is shot, so she's nursing a dying husband. And yet the American command comes in and makes her prepare them food. Everything they have on their farm, everything they've saved is gone now. She has to feed the American generals. Laura graces them with her wit. And all the while, as the Americans are talking over dinner and all night, she listens to their plans. She knows exactly where they're going to attack, exactly how many units, everything they're going to do. When the Americans fall asleep with a full belly, Laura sets off at night. It's believed, we don't know exactly, but she walked roughly 20 miles in the middle of the night, a young woman alone. 20 miles. She comes up upon some Mohawk Indians in the area, and through a bit of their English command, she tells them she needs to meet with a British officer. There's a lieutenant named Fitzgibbons nearby with just a few men. So they take her to Fitzgibbon. She tells this lieutenant, a few Brits and Canadians and a few Mohawk warriors, that the American army is marching the next day and there's no way to stop them. But she knows exactly where they are and exactly where they're going. They set an ambush and they annihilate the American army, thanks to Laura's secrets. She helped save Canada from the invaders. Imagine her bravery, knowing that she was committing treason and walking 20 miles through the woods by herself through hostile Indian territory to find help to save Canada. So think of that next time, Marilyn, next time you eat some good Laura Secord chocolate. This is Mary Pickersgill, who's sort of the other Betsy Ross. So Mary Pickersgill, this is also during the War of 1812. She has a rough life. Mary's mother is a seamstress, loses some siblings. Mary gets married, buries a husband, remarries, buries 3 of her 4 children. Her one husband was guarding a weapons depot, and it blew up and he was killed. So Mary Pickersgill is trying to make a living for herself and her surviving daughter. She not only is a talented seamstress, but she also starts making flags. So, and she's quite good at sewing stars, which are apparently hard to sew. I'm not much of a seamstress, I guess you could say, but she specializes in stars. So during the War of 1812, the problem is the British in August of 1814 attacked Washington, D.C. And on August 24th, 1814, the British burned down the Capitol, what is now the White House, the Treasury, State and War Departments, the naval yards. They torched the capital city and invade the capital city. Now they're marching for Baltimore, which is actually their main target. Even though Washington is the capital, it's a backwater town, unpopulated, just a few buildings. Baltimore at the time was one of the largest cities, one of the most important seaports, if not the most important seaport, and a real den of resistance to the British. A lot of our privateers, that would be sort of a government-sanctioned pirate, were operating in and out of Baltimore. Also, Baltimore had a fort, Fort McHenry. Anybody been to Inner Harbor in Baltimore? It's lovely. You can see the old ships. Good, Rhonda, me too. Love it. Go to Fort McHenry. It's one of my favorite forts. It's still in mint condition. At any rate, this is one of the most important forts in the country, guarding one of the most important cities in the country. Moreover, Fort McHenry had a good deal of our powder, cannons, muskets. In other words, the armory, the arms depot at McHenry was such that if the British could seize it or blow it up, we couldn't fight back. So the British are marching by land on Baltimore, and we managed to repel them in an amazing feat. But then they're sailing an armada of warships, a fleet of warships into Baltimore. They're going to sail right past Fort McHenry, blow it up, destroy the ammo, sail in and torch Baltimore. So this is going to be devastating. There was a crusty old Revolutionary War hero, 2 of them actually, named Smith and Stricker. And the governor, the mayor were cowardly politicians. Their advice to the residents of Baltimore: run, escape. Stricker and Smith say, no, we're going to stay and fight. They did several brilliant things. I'll just name 2 for the sake of time. One is they ordered all the candles and lanterns in the city snuffed out. Then they took candles and lanterns and they hung them some distance from the city in the woods, because they knew the British would be arriving around sunset. That way the British would bomb the city at night. The British targeted the lights, so they blew up the woods. The second thing they do was they commandeered ships, boats, and the British sunk these ships and boats at the entrance to the harbor, creating a gauntlet, a seawall, if you will. So when the British Armada sailed up, they couldn't sail into Baltimore because of the wall of ships. So the British were forced to drop anchor at the mouth of the harbor and launch their artillery barrage. They had Congreve rockets, long-range naval guns. They were going to hit the Fort McHenry and hit Baltimore from afar. So the war begins, or the battle begins rather. Inside Fort McHenry were only a few men, and they had a young major. He was, I think he was in his late 20s. His name was Armistead. They didn't even have a general or colonel. They had this young major. The major was worried about Baltimore collapsing, people running. He was worried that the men in his fort under this all night long barrage would fold. So he ordered, in advance of the attack, a flag. And he hired Mary Pickersgill. He wanted the biggest flag ever made in the country, over 30 feet high, over 40 feet long. And it took her 6 weeks. She rented out a, as you can see from the image on the right, a warehouse that she and her daughter, she had 2 nieces and a maid, and all of them worked tirelessly for 6 weeks to make the biggest flag there was. Now, when the bombardment starts, there's a problem. The British had arrested a doctor, a Scottish physician named Beans, Dr. Beans, not Mr. Bean, Dr. Beans. And Dr. Beans was a Scotsman who supported our cause. And what he did was he would care for the wounded British soldiers but spy at the same time. So Dr. Beans fed important intelligence to the Americans. The British were so angry that Admiral Cockburn, who was leading the invasion, and General Ross ordered him arrested. They took Dr. Beans aboard their flagship sitting off the port of Baltimore by the wall of ships. The ship was the HMS Tonic. This is their flagship of the British war fleet. And they told Dr. Beans that he's going to stand trial and he'll be put to death for treason to the crown. Well, the problem is Dr. Beans is a bit of a hero among Americans, and he knows the president, one James Madison. So they hired an attorney, and a skilled attorney, a young, very handsome, skilled attorney who was a part-time poet, to go out and negotiate for Dr. Beans's release. This lawyer/poet's name was Francis Scott Key. So he boards the HMS Tonic and gets the British to agree to release Dr. Beans. But they say, not until the next day, because you and Dr. Beans are privy to too much information. Tonight, we're going to reduce Baltimore to rubble. Tonight, we're going to destroy Fort McHenry with an artillery barrage. So Beans and Francis Scott Key are stuck on the HMS Tonic all night long. And the British launch Congreve rockets and artillery all night long. Inside Fort McHenry, the men are withering this massive barrage and inspiring everybody with the largest flag ever made in the country. And Dr. Beans and Francis Scott Key walk the deck watching the rockets' red glare, watching the bombs bursting in air, in hopes that in the morning their flag would still be there and the Star-Spangled Banner was flying. And we held off and we beat the British. Francis Scott Key and Dr. Beans were released. Key put quill to paper and wrote a poem which became our national anthem. Today you can see Old Glory, the Star-Spangled Banner, in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. And it's all because of the tireless work for 6 weeks of Mary Pickersgill. Mary Pickersgill became something of a celebrity at the time, although sadly we've forgotten her today. And people donated money to her. She used that money to set up a home for older women who had lost husbands in the war. That way they had a place to live. Remember, we used to not have Social Security, unemployment compensation, Medicare, nothing. Our governor would have loved it. So next, Sojourner Truth. Her name was Isabella Bumfrey. Isabella Bumfrey. She was a slave living in New York, owned by the Dutch. Her first language was Dutch, actually, and her whole life she spoke with sort of a slave dialect mixed with a Dutch accent. People thought she had an intriguing way of speaking. Isabella Bumfrey suffered a horrific life. She was repeatedly raped by her master. She bore him children. Then she was sold to another slave owner, and she couldn't take her children with her and would never see them again. The new slave owner repeatedly raped her. She bore children to that slave owner. Then he sold her to a third slave owner, and she couldn't take her children with her. She's repeatedly raped by the third slave owner and bears children with him. She wants to marry a man, a fellow slave. The slave owner, the third slave owner's wife, was always angry at Isabella Baumgartner because she knew that her husband, the slave owner, was raping her. So when Isabella Baumgartner wanted to, Bumfrey, when she wanted to marry the slave, the wife of the owner ordered that both of them be beaten. They beat the male slave so badly that he was killed right in front of her. She decides it's time to leave. She wants to run away to gain her freedom. She takes one daughter with her and runs away, and she makes it. She changes her name from Isabella Bumfrey to Sojourner Truth. What a great name. And she becomes an advocate for ending slavery and for women's rights. She becomes a great speaker. She's sort of the female Frederick Douglass, I guess one could say. None other than the great white Massachusetts abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, finds her and Douglass and writes books about both of them. She goes on a speaker circuit. She's probably the first black woman that any white person ever heard speak in public. And she's a captivating orator. In the 1850s in Ohio, they asked her to keynote a convention where she gives probably her most famous speech. It's called Ain't I a Woman? I encourage you to look it up, Ain't I a Woman? I make my students read it, along with George Washington's farewell address, along with Elie Wiesel's Night, along with Ben Franklin's autobiography, along with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. We read the good stuff. Ain't I a Woman? She basically approaches it like this. They say women aren't capable of doing things, but these hips have borne 11 children. Ain't I a woman? They say women aren't as strong as a man. These hands have carried just as much cotton and tobacco 12 hours a day as any man has carried. Ain't I a woman? They say women can't get an education, but I have raised all these children against my will, but ain't I a woman? So she just shows how strong she's had to be in an unimaginably difficult life. So she becomes one of the leading voices for abolition and for women's rights, and probably the first prominent black woman to be a public figure in American history. This is Elizabeth Van Lew. Rhonda will remember her from one of my books. She was known as Crazy Bet, and that's her house on the right. And there she is on the left. So Elizabeth Van Lew's family hails from Philadelphia, influenced by the Quakers, which means they were supportive of women's education, and they were abolitionists. Her father moves to Richmond. There's the family home on the right. And it's probably the largest home in Richmond at the time. They were probably the wealthiest family. The father passed, leaving everything to her. She never marries. One of the reasons in Richmond they called her Crazy Bet, because she was a woman who didn't marry. Secondly, she believed in women's equality. Thirdly, she was an abolitionist. So to the folks in the South, she was Crazy Bet. She would play that role as a crazy woman shortly. So what she does is she uses the family's money to buy slaves, but then she frees them. Many of them choose to stay and live with her because they can at least live freely and treated with respect there. Where else could they go? So she has a house full of freed slaves living with her. Richmond is the Confederates' capital. Initially it was Montgomery, but then they moved it to Richmond, which was a much larger city with multiple railways, roads, and the important James River all leading to it. So strategically, it was a much better site than Montgomery, which is in the middle of nowhere and with no major roadways and railways. So in Richmond, what she does is she finds her cause. The Confederates, of course, make Richmond the capital. They open up some prisons, one of them called Libby, which I just wrote a book about. And these prisons are used to torture Union prisoners. They're used for propaganda. Really, some of them, Belle Isle, Libby, some of the most wretched, hellacious prisons in American history. Absolutely unspeakable horrors occurred in these prisons as Union soldiers from private to general were slaughtered in them. The way the South treated Northern prisoners is remarkable. It's shocking. So what she does is she cares for the prisoners. The entire South, as well as Richmond, were in a starvation atmosphere by halfway through the Civil War, which is 1861 to 1865. So she visits the prison because she has so much money she can afford food when no one else can. She prepares two types of food, two dishes. She'll have one big thing that they carry down to give to the guards. That's to bribe them. She says, now I want you to let me in so I can give the other ones to the Union prisoners. The guards are starving, so they take the deal because she shows up. Imagine a cake and porridge and pudding when you're starving. She shows up and they're swiffing it. They're like, we'll take it. So they let her, so she feeds the Union soldiers to keep them alive. The other thing she does is she passes secrets on to them. She turns out to be one of the top Union spies in the entirety of the Confederacy in the capital city itself. She learns General Ulysses Grant and General Benjamin Butler teach her how to use codex. So they write to her in code. She sends messages back in code. She writes with a lemon juice and a milk mixture to make it invisible. And then when you warm it up, the lettering appears. She risks her life repeatedly to pass intel back and forth with these Union officers and soldiers in Richmond. She would have a secret compartment in the bottom of some of her serving bowls. She'd give it to them. They open up the compartment. There were notes passed back. She would have eggs, hard-boiled eggs, and on top she would give some to the guards. The ones on the bottom were already hollowed out with a hole in the bottom and a note was stuck in them. So Union soldiers that escaped, she had slaves and former slaves all around the city at key points, and they would throw them in the back of the wagon, throw produce and straw over them, and quick race them back to Crazy Bet's house. She hid them in her attic. A remarkable woman. The Confederacy didn't find out who this famous, infamous spy was until after the war. An angry mob showed up and surrounded her house with torches. They were going to burn her and former slaves in her house to the ground. She goes out on the porch, according to one of 4 Richmond newspapers, and starts screaming at the mob, telling them, if you touch me, Ulysses Grant is on his way and he will not be happy. She talks the mob down. Indeed, Grant loved Crazy Bet. When he finds out that she was now destitute because they stole all of her money at the end of the war, he hired her as a postmaster so she would have a job. Former Union soldiers who escaped, including Paul Revere's grandson, all sent her money. She lived a long life and was one of the great spies for the Union and saved countless slaves and Union prisoners of war. Crazy Bet. This is Victoria Woodhall. Victoria Woodhall is a remarkable woman. In her 20s and 30s, she's the first woman to open up a brokerage on Wall Street. She's a self-taught lawyer. She writes her own book. She's an advocate for what she called free love. According to Victoria Woodhall, she said if a woman has an affair, she's basically branded, and that's the end of it. If a man does, it's no problem. If a woman wants to have sexual relations, she's seen as a prostitute. If a man wants to, it's fine. Basically, a lot of physical intimacy is nothing but rape from a woman's perspective in the 1800s, is what she's saying. So she's on the cutting edge of advocating for family planning, women's rights, the whole 9 yards. She's so frustrated at the lack of the pace of change that in her 30s, she decides to do something big. She becomes the first woman in American history to run for president. Victoria Woodhall ran in 1872. She was only 34. The Constitution in Article 2 says that you need to be 35. Nonetheless, she ran. Now, when she tried to register to vote, she was arrested. Later, when she tried to campaign, she was arrested. And when she tried to vote for herself, she was arrested. So Victoria Woodhall encountered massive pushback. Conservative men attacked her viciously with false rumors. I mean, she was the target of a number of salacious and untrue attacks and lies, but she soldiered on. She's remarkable, young, attractive, smart, indefatigable, non-stop. So that's Victoria Woodhall, first woman to run for president. Oh, by the way, her vice presidential running mate, Frederick Douglass. How about that for a ticket? And they ran on an equal rights party because neither political party would have them. This is Carrie Chapman Cat. Speaking of women getting the right to vote, very few people have made a bigger contribution to the passage of the 19th Amendment in the year 1920, giving women the right to vote, than Triple C, Carrie Chapman Cat. So Carrie Chapman Cat was a brilliant young woman who encounters what all brilliant young women encountered throughout history. Their fathers and others didn't want them to go to school. She begged and begged. The father finally agreed that she would attend what is today Iowa State, out in the farmlands. She had to work to put herself through school, so she was working multiple menial jobs. After graduating at the top of her class, nobody will hire her, of course, so she's working menial jobs. But then she becomes an advocate for the women's right to vote. Now, in order to pass the 19th Amendment, you need to have it pass 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. That's the constitutional requirement. And then in order to be ratified, 3/4 of the states. That's a pretty high bar, everybody. There's a reason why we only have 27 amendments to our Constitution. So the women's movement is getting frustrated by the slow pace of change. They can't get it passed. Plus, there were 2 wings of the women's movement. There was the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. One was younger, one was older, one was more progressive, one was more conservative. One favored what we would today call abortion rights and family planning. Susan B. Anthony and the others did not. So there was a rift in the movement. Carrie Chapman Cat does 2 things. Number 1, she heals the rift and brings both factions together to create the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Secondly, she comes up with a way of ratifying. She says instead of trying to get 3/4 of the states to come on board. That's impossible. Let's just pass one. If we can get one state to give women the right to vote, we can prove that the world's not going to end and people aren't going to grow horns like conservative critics were saying. Just one state. And we can prove that women are capable of doing this. It was viewed at the time that women were not capable of making a judicious decision like voting. So everybody said, that's a smart idea. And she said, if we pass one state, we'll have a model, then we'll go for two, then we'll go for three. And eventually we're going to need those states anyways, because we need 3/4 of them to ratify the amendment. So everybody's applauding her as a genius. So they assume that we're going to start, at what state would you target? You would target like New York or Massachusetts or Connecticut or something like that. She said, no, we're going to go out to like Idaho and Utah and Colorado and out to the wild, wild west where it's like a John Wayne cowboy set. They thought she was mad. She said, those are the states to go to. Why? Because there's no women out there, which means the men are really desperate. So she goes out there and she says, if you agree to give women the right to vote, I promise I'll bring wagon loads of women out here the next spring. And the men said, yes, where do we sign? So then she gets one after another, those states out west to sign. She makes good on her deal, but not before doing something else. She says, before I bring all the women out, I need more than just the right to vote. We need the right to own property, to inherit, to divorce, to appear in court, to get a business license, to get a medical license, and the men out there said, sure, whatever you want, just where do we sign? And then what she did is she went back east and she took wagons full of women out west, and the men were happy. And what she did is, let's say today, if there's a divorce, almost by default, most of the times, the more primary custody would go to the woman. Back then, if there was a divorce, the kids always went to the man. In fact, it was so bad that if one's husband died, the courts could take your children and give them to a brother or your late husband's brother. Women, could inherit property and so forth. So young women that were facing a divorce, especially those that had children, they were desperate to get the hell out and move out west where they had rights of divorce and rights of inheritance and rights of custody. Women that wanted to open up a business or had lost a loved one or didn't want to marry, that wanted you couldn't get a business license in most places, they went out west. So women entrepreneurs went out by the wagon loads. Carrie Chapman made everybody happy. The men out there were happy. And eventually we ratified the 19th Amendment. This is Edith Bowling Galt. And that picture on the right shows you everything right there, how sassy she was. So Edith Bowling Galt was an interesting young woman. She came from some money. She was thrown out of her school for misbehaving. She was, quote unquote, headstrong. Eventually, her family had to send her to a private boarding school. Guess what happened there? Yep. She was thrown out of that one. So they sent her to another, and she was thrown out of that one. So Edith Bowling Galt was a sassy, opinionated, headstrong woman. She married an older jeweler named Galt. And he dies, and she inherits the jewelry store and makes an awful lot of money. Now, she's quite scandalous because this saucy widow used to do two things that shocked. She moved to Washington, D.C. It shocked the capital city. So much so that, and I've read letters from, let's say, senators' wives who gossiped about her. The newspapers followed her. Today, she would be a Kardashian with her own reality show. The only difference, Edith actually had talent and was intelligent, unlike the Kardashians. So Edith is scandalizing. What were the two big scandals everybody wrote about? Rhonda and Marilyn, am I allowed to say this? Because this is the Friends of the Stirling Road Library. I don't know. Am I allowed to say? You give me permission? Okay, I got permission. All right. Here's the two big scandals. Are you ready? Is Broward County ready? Number one, she drove her own car. Number two, she went to parties unescorted. That was considered heresy at the time. So that was Edith. Well, the picture on the left, you probably recognize the guy pretending to sign a bill. That's the President of the United States. That's Woodrow Thomas Wilson. That's Woodrow Wilson. She called him Tommy. Woodrow Wilson's wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, dies in the White House. Wilson's grief-stricken until he meets Edith. And let's just say, because I don't want this to get past PG-13, Let's just say that she rocks his world. Wilson is head over heels for the saucy widow, Edith. All of official Washington is on an Edith watch. They would follow her around. What the public loved is they would see her entering and leaving the White House at all hours of the day and night. When she and Wilson would go out courting, the press followed them. My favorite typo in the history of newspapering occurred when Wilson and Edith were out on a date. The newspaper meant to read, and I quote, "The president was again seen entertaining the widow Galt in public." That was the quote. They misspelled one word. And what the quote said was, "The president was again seen entering the widow Galt in public." So it was a big scandal. He marries Edith, and she becomes the first lady. It gets better, everybody. During World War I, she's in the war room, encoding and decoding, encrypting wartime secrets with the president. This saucy widow. She's got like CIA Today type of credentials. What happens is the war ends, and Wilson is the architect of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles that ends the First World War, the Great War. Even though Wilson's the architect of the League of Nations, the Republicans in the Senate wouldn't ratify it. They wouldn't do anything. Could you imagine the Republicans not wanting to pass or do anything? Shocking. So Wilson decides to go on a nationwide speaking tour to try to get the public to put pressure on the Republicans so that we could ratify this and join the League of Nations. By the way, we never did. He has a massive stroke and almost dies. He's bedridden for months. He loses the use of one arm, one leg. He can barely speak. And during that month after month after month, he doesn't meet with the press, doesn't meet with the Congress, doesn't meet with his cabinet. Who meets with the press, the Congress, and the cabinet? You guessed it, Edith. And the kicker to this is she's basically running the country 1 year before the 19th Amendment. This is Gertrude Ellison. Gertrude would never marry. Her family were Jewish refugees who faced one pogrom after another in Europe. They moved to America. Gertrude loves science and medicine. She wants to go to a good college to get a degree, and of course, because she's a woman, they won't admit her because women don't study science and medicine. She finally gets into a school and wants to study science and medicine, and they try to persuade her not to. She refuses and does. Even though she graduates with straight A's, she wants to go to grad school, get a PhD or get a medical degree, and you guessed it, no one would admit her. So she goes to work for the two gentlemen at the bottom of the screen. These are scientists and physicians working on medicines, cures, vaccines, all that sort of a thing. And they're working with this small startup called Johnson & Johnson. And these two guys just mass produce vaccines, pills, cures to diseases. I mean, they're rewriting things. So they go out on their own. They move to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and do a medical startup that continues to produce all these marvels of medicine. And they take Gertrude with her. These two men win the Nobel Prize in medicine for their breakthroughs in medicine. When they pass away, the world gets a hold of their notes. Guess who it was that was coming up with all the vaccines and medical breakthroughs? It was Gertrude. That's why they took her with her everywhere. Gertrude would eventually win the Nobel Prize for her work. So one of the truly great, never married, devoted her life to trying to solve, cure diseases. One of the truly great scientists in American history, and nobody knows her, but probably everybody on this call today has benefited from one medicine or another that she came up with. That's Gertrude Ellison. Sacagawea. So that's on the picture there in the top of the painting. That's Lewis and Clark. Of course, Thomas Jefferson buys Louisiana from the Emperor Napoleon, who needs cash to fight his war in Europe, so he sells it on the cheap. The Louisiana Purchase is not just the state of Louisiana, it's basically the entirety of the Mississippi River. So it doubles the size of the United States in the early 1800s, 1803 and 1804 when it comes through. Doubles the size of the United States. To see what he had discovered, to find the fabled Northwest Passage, to see if there is truly a great ocean on the other side, To make treaties with the Indians and also to satisfy his own intellectual curiosity, Thomas Jefferson mounts an expedition. They call themselves the Corps of Discovery, CORPS, the French pronunciation, the Corps of Discovery. And he gets two very capable men to lead the Corps of Discovery. One is Meriwether Lewis, who's wearing the tricone hat right there, looking revolutionary. Meriwether Lewis is Thomas Jefferson's secretary. Like Jefferson, he's a Renaissance man. He's an intellectual, well-educated. He's a botanist. He's a poet. He's a world-class intellectual. Now you need somebody to navigate the rivers, navigate under the stars, to build campfires, hunt, protect everybody. So that's where Clark comes in. He's the guy with the coonskin hat beside him. William Clark is a big badass. He's a big tough guy. So he picked two brilliant, capable men. Both of them complemented one another. And Lewis and Clark and their small Corps of Discovery make it all the way across the country and back. They lose only one man during the entire mission. Now remember, everybody, crossing this country, crossing the Rocky Mountains, the Great Plains, crossing this country and back in the early 1800s, this is equivalent to the moonshot of the 1960s. And these guys only lose one man, Sergeant Floyd. And it wasn't through any mistake of their own. He got appendicitis, and so nobody knew what to do. Anyways, they're worried about getting across the country. They're worried about hostile Indian tribes. So they settle down for a winter in the Mandan camp. They're worried about what is today Montana, Idaho, and the Dakotas, because there's a lot of Indian nations there who had bad experiences with the handful of French and white trappers that they encountered. So they need a guide who knows the land and knows Indian languages to lead them across the country. There in the Mandan camp is a little girl named Sacagawea. We're not sure how old she is, maybe 13 or 14. She's very young, and she's pregnant, and she gives birth in the Mandan camp. Sacagawea had a horrible upbringing. She was sold from one tribe to another, to another, to another. Warring parties would slaughter one tribe and take the young women. So she was repeatedly raped and sold and beaten. But by being sold from tribe to tribe to tribe, she learns a lot of native languages. She learns much of the West because she's all around it. She knows where to go. She knows how to cure diseases. So she gives birth in the camp, and Clark takes a real fondness to this young girl. He understands her mettle, how tough she is from this upbringing. She also knows enough English, and he knows enough Indian dialects that they can communicate. She was sold along with another little girl named Otter Woman to a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau. And Charbonneau is a drunken and abusive second-rate character. So the Mandan Indians say, why don't you hire Charbonneau? Because he can speak English and he knows his way. But Lewis and Clark can't stand Charbonneau. They're impressed with Sacagawea, so they hire him only to have her lead them. Charbonneau gets drunk one night in camp and does what he always does. He's trying to rape or beat Sacagawea. Clark is twice Charbonneau's size, comes in and beats the hell out of Charbonneau and tells him never to touch her again. So he pretty much saves Sacagawea. Sacagawea leads the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery all the way across the country, and they make it. Imagine the presence of a teenage girl with a baby, an Indian girl with a baby. And what a symbol of peace. Any tribe that they encountered knew that they weren't a war tribe, a war party, because there's a little girl with a baby leading their effort. She makes peace, she negotiates, she really helps Lewis and Clark do one of the greatest expeditions in world history. When it's over, they go back east. It doesn't end so well for Lewis. He, in a fit of depression, puts a gun in his mouth and commits suicide, despite being a hero and a remarkable man. Sacagawea, Clark asks her and her young boy, Clark calls him Pompey. He asks them to come out and live with him in Missouri. He's now the governor of Missouri. Unfortunately, Sacagawea dies in her early 20s, but Clark adopts her son and raises him, and the boy has a wonderful life and does great things. So Sacagawea.
Robert, I hate to interrupt you, but it's about 5 minutes before 2. And I know you have you could stay here all day and talk, but I know you
Here's
have
what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to
presentation.
my last one because I want to take questions.
Okay.
You all know Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the one who organized the Seneca Falls Convention. That was in July of 1848, a 2-day convention at a Wesleyan chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. That's the convention that first put forth a document. They called it the Declaration of Sentiments to promote a woman's right to vote. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the organizer of the convention and author of the document. Women were said to be too sentimental. So, in a wonderful twist, she named it the Declaration of Sentiments, which said that all men and women are created equal. You all know Harriet Tubman, the leader of the Underground Railway, who Harriet was about 5 foot tall and weighed about a buck, a petite woman. She led countless slaves to freedom on the Underground Railway, despite wanted posters, dead or alive. After this, when the war started, she served as a scout and spy for the Union. Just a remarkable woman who had a dream one night that she was Moses, and God told her that he didn't want his children to suffer the bondage of slavery, to let my people go. So she thought she was Moses. She was hit in the head by her slave owner with either a brick or a rock. The accounts are unclear. And it probably fractured her skull. She had internal swelling and bleeding. So she would have these like epileptic kind of episodes where she saw colors. And, so during one of those, she thought she was Moses. This is Jane Addams, who created the Hull House, Hull, in Chicago and elsewhere, a place for pregnant women, raped women, divorced women, impoverished children, women with young children could all go, get an education, learn a vocation. They had schools for kids. They had health clinics. They had libraries. They had playgrounds. Jane Addams would be the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize. She had there was another woman that was a big fan of hers, thought she was the best ever, and that other woman was Eleanor Roosevelt. This is Rachel Carson, much like Gertrude Ellison. As a young girl, loved science, couldn't get into school anywhere. Finally got into school, majored in marine biology, wanted to go get a PhD. Nobody would admit her. Had trouble getting a job. She went to work for the Park Service. She was a brilliant writer, and she made an important discovery in 1962 that all the DDT chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, insecticides, all these chemicals are carcinogenous. They're dangerous to people because we didn't test them once upon a time. We didn't have that, we didn't have government regulations, which people call socialism. It's called keeping you alive. And she also realized that entire species of birds were in imminent danger of going extinct. Why? Because all the chemicals would get into the water systems and into insects. And then as birds ate the fish and insects, their eggs wouldn't harden. Birds are short-lived. So if you have entire nesting colonies where the eggs aren't hardening, birds are going extinct. And that included my favorite bird, the pelican. I think they're so goofy, they're adorable. It included one of the largest birds on Earth, the great California condor. It included the fastest animal on Earth, the peregrine falcon, and our national symbol, the bald eagle. And she wrote a book called Silent Spring, and she was blasted by business types, conservatives, just blasted for the book. She called for regulation of this, and she made a philosophic argument. Not only are birds going to go extinct, which means that pests and mice and insects will overrun farm crops, but metaphysically, what would a spring day feel like? What would it be for the human soul, the human condition, if we were to open up a window on a spring morning and not hear the birds singing, Silent Spring? So Rachel Carson launched the environmental movement. Tragically, she didn't live to see her fame. Last but not least, Charlotte Sorkind. She would later marry a psychologist named Nosh Pitts. Charlotte was the Harriet Tubman of the Holocaust. The picture on the right, did anybody ever see the great D-Day movie, The Longest Day? Yeah, everybody's seen that, right? Good. John Wayne, Sean Connery, ridiculous cast. Red buttons, right? So it's a great and reasonably accurate D-Day movie. Do you remember the opening scene? There's a group of French and Jewish resistance fighters who have a wagon with hay and they're hiding guns in it. And all of a sudden come marching down the road a bunch of Nazis. And of course, they're going to discover those resistance fighters. right around that time, and here's the actual picture from the movie. And I remember this one well because as a young kid, when I first saw this movie, I liked that actress on the right. That was my gal right there. She comes riding down. Doesn't she look like a young Sophia Loren, kind of? Yeah. So she comes riding down the road on her bicycle. She sees that the resistance fighters are about to get caught, so she wrecks her bike and pulls her dress up. The German soldiers run over to help her, and she's feigning, that she can't get up. They're helping her. Meanwhile, the resistance fighters run away and are saved. That opening scene was a true story that inspired that scene. And the real girl was Charlotte Noshpitz here on the left. She was one of the leaders of the French resistance. Her family was Jewish. Her mother was killed in the concentration camps. She wanted to save her father, who was a famous professor. She forged his paperwork and got him to Switzerland, got him out of harm's way. Then she had an idea. What if I save all these Jewish children stuck in France and occupied territories by forging their paperwork? She would forge the paperwork and by night lead, sort of like the inaccurate scene in The Sound of Music where, they go up over the mountains to, freedom. She would lead young children, Jewish children, to freedom, going to Lisboa, Lisbon, Portugal, or to Switzerland and elsewhere. And then when she delivered them, she'd go back and forge more papers. She did this, everybody, as a teenager. What a hero. I'm happy to say that she lived through the Holocaust and World War II. She marries a psychologist. They moved to New York. She lives a long life, as you can see, just passing in 2017. I regret I could never find a way to get her to meet with me. But so she's responsible for being one of the main operatives of the French resistance, and she saved countless Jewish children during the Holocaust. And those are a few of my heroines from history. Thank you. Yeah, I think you're muted, Rhonda. Thank you, Julissa.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I wish we could have heard about all the women. Maybe next time you come, you can finish it off. If you have any questions, can you stay a couple more minutes, Robert?
Sure. Thank you, Susan.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
You want to enter something in the chat? Right now in the chat, we have, thank you so much. It's wonderful as always. Wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, Corey, thank you so much. Corey's one of the leaders of 10 Days of Connection. Thanks for all you do with the community.
Thank you guys for hosting this and so many other events. We're very grateful for your partnership, and this is a great way to kick it off. I feel like you know a lot, but then when you listen to someone like Mr. Watson, you realize how much more you can always learn. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you for what you're doing. Yeah, I've been an historian for 31 years, and I tell every one of my classes, and I pretty much say it in every book I've written, that there's more we don't know than we do know. And just about the time you think you know something, you realize how little you know. I've written books on the Revolutionary War, on the Holocaust, the Civil War, and you think everything about the Revolution, the Holocaust, and the Civil War is known. And, I stumbled into some huge stories, some of the most important stories of those three wars, which I had never really heard of, right? So there's a lot out there. But when you get to women's history, Corey, there's really a lot we don't know.
There's so much, because it's so we say it's like lost to history, but it's there if you know where to look for it.
Yeah, because most women have been rendered invisible in history because of not having a voice. So thank you.
Well, I don't see any questions. Everybody's just saying thank you. If just a reminder, if you go on the chat, there's the website listed for Friends of the Stirling Road Library for all sorts of activities in person and on Zoom we're having. Also for 10 Days of Connection, their website's listed. And also I would appreciate if you could complete the survey. That website is listed on the chat. And I'll probably send out the survey personally to a few of you so you could help us get some feedback. So I guess that's it. Robert, thank you again.
Thank
Hope
you,
to see
Rhonda.
you soon.
It
And
was
thanks
wonderful.
everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good
Thank
day.
you, Rhonda.
We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.